HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Fool's Errand, Creating the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the Age of Bush, Obama, and Trump, by Lonnie Bunch III. Read by J.D. Jackson. Preface. Lately, it occurs to me what a long, strange trip it's been. Grateful Dead. Truckin', 1970. I can remember quite vividly how 13 years ago I tried to talk myself out of accepting the position of founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Why take on a task that had proven impossible to accomplish for nearly a century? Why did I think that I could craft a museum that would explore the sweep of African American history and culture without staff or collections? How does one lead an institution that was a museum in name only, yet was expected to grapple with one of the most divisive and important issues in America, race? And can the candor and complexity needed to engage what has always divided Americans occur within the Smithsonian institution? A complex known more for celebration and commemoration than for embracing controversy and illuminating all the dark corners of the American past? I wondered if I was simply a fool to even contemplate these challenges. Then I remembered a novel that I was first introduced to in an undergraduate history class taught by Thomas DeBacco at American University. Written in 1879 by Albion W. Tourget, it was entitled A Fool's Errand, a novel of the South during Reconstruction. Tourget was an abolitionist and lawyer who ventured into the South during Reconstruction to help ensure that the former Confederate states would return to the Union in a manner that would guarantee that the formerly enslaved would have the rights and the protections granted all citizens. Tourget witnessed how violence and intimidation destroyed the experiment of Reconstruction. Upon his return to the North, he crafted a novel as a way to express his frustrations, his anger, and also his hopes that there would one day be a fairer and freer South. To Tourget, A Fool's Errand was worth the risk, the fear, and the costs, because it was a noble cause that was essential and could help a people, a nation, heal. As I reread the novel in 2016, I saw the journey to build a museum that could help bridge the chasms that divide us as a fool's errand, but an errand worthy of the burdens, an errand that would force me, allow me, to use all that I had learned throughout my career. A journey that could help, using history and culture as a tool, a nation come to grips with its tortured racial past and maybe find understanding and hope through the creation of a museum. I was excited enough to say yes to the offer, but unsure of just how much a museum could truly help a country be better. An answer came nearly a year after the museum opened on September 24th, 2016. Whenever I go from my parking space to my office, I ride the service elevator so that I can engage and thank members of the security and maintenance units. That day, a young African-American woman pushing a cleaning cart into the elevator asked if she could speak to me. With a mixture of trepidation and pride, she said, "I don't know if anybody has said this, but I want to thank you for all that you did for us by building this museum, our museum." When I tried to explain that so many people deserve the credit for the museum, she nodded, but continued speaking about what the museum has come to mean to her, especially when juxtaposed with the Trump White House and the Washington Monument. She went on to say that walking through the museum reminds her of the strength of her people and gives her hope for the future. As she exited the elevator, She said that based on what she has learned in the museum, we will be okay. I have had many people comment about the museum, from presidents to foreign dignitaries, from Baptist ministers to former high school classmates. Yet her clear and heartfelt appreciation encapsulated much of what I had hoped the museum could be, a site of memory that could educate and inspire. A museum whose collections, exhibitions, and scholarship would aid the visitors in better understanding the world they inhabit. An institution that would re-center African American history and culture as key to our understanding of who we are as Americans, and ultimately, a building that was seen as a symbol of possibility, resistance, and resiliency on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The need for that resistance and resiliency was reinforced by an event in August of 2017. On August 12, 2017, a group of racist white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and members of the Ku Klux Klan descended on Charlottesville, Virginia, supposedly to protest the removal of a statue honoring Confederate General Robert E. Lee. In actuality, their goal was, through marches and mayhem, to return America to a time when racism was a core American value. During the ensuing riot, an anti-racist protester, Heather Heyer, was killed. The day prior to the melee and murder, two white supremacists were visiting Washington, D.C. They hailed an Uber driven by an African-American woman. As the car approached the building that houses the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the passengers launched into a racist tirade, spewing epithets and hatred. The driver immediately stopped and ordered the two men out of her car with a warning not to tarnish a museum that matters. There is no way that we could have predicted how visible and how important the museum has become. I knew that as part of the Smithsonian institution, the museum would have a national and international profile, but no one could have anticipated that it would become such a site of pilgrimage and meaning, and I could not have imagined the array of experiences that would change me. I am still stunned that Oprah hugged me and Quincy Jones calls me at home, that people stop me on the street to offer prayers or say thank you, or to complain about who or what is not in the museum, or that my words and opinions find their way to op-eds or to television, and that despite hundreds of thousands of miles flown, I still have no premier status. All of which would not have been possible without the creativity and sacrifice of so many. While this book chronicles the creation of the National Museum through my lens, my experiences, it is a story of hundreds who labored, who believed, and who sacrificed. Thanks to colleagues in the museum and in the academy, the museum's guiding council, and thousands who provided financial, moral, and spiritual support, a century-long dream was realized, and, as a result, a museum, a gift, was given to the nation. Lonnie G. Bunch III, London, England, November 2018. 1. What happens to a dream deferred? Langston Hughes, 1951. Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Winston Churchill. My mantra for that day, September 24th, 2016, was whatever you do, don't trip and fall. After 11 years of struggling, believing, convincing others to believe, threading the political needle, and surviving nearly 495 fundraising sojourns, tens of thousands had gathered on the National Mall to bear witness to the opening dedication ceremony of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Sitting under the museum's porch on a stage with President and Mrs. Obama, Former President Bush and First Lady Laura Bush seated just in front of me, Chief Justice John Roberts, the Chancellor of the Smithsonian, across the stage from me, the American icon John Lewis next to me, and an array of senior Smithsonian officials everywhere. I finally let myself accept the enormity of what we had accomplished and what the opening of a museum intended to help America confront its tortured racial past could mean to a nation weary of a divisive presidential campaign and a country still struggling to define its identity in the 21st century. To control my nerves, I forced myself to take in the crowds. The more than 7,000 VIPs, in other words, their support had earned them chairs, and the multitude who watched the ceremony on jumbotrons from the hillside and from the grounds of the Washington Monument. I realized how much I did not want this moment to end. I did not want to forget a single second, because while the success of this endeavor was due to the efforts of hundreds, the vision and the stress of leadership was mine alone. I was gratified to see an audience more representative of America's diversity than what one commonly experiences in Washington. The crowd, while well represented by those usually associated with this company town, former President Bill Clinton, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, Nancy Pelosi, Minority Leader, also included museum supporters and visitors who just wanted to experience this moment. It felt more like a mini Obama-like inauguration rather than the celebration of a museum opening. Even the speeches soared to match the significance of the moment. President Bush delivered what I consider to be the best speech of his career, reminding us that slavery was America's original sin, and that a great nation embraces its past rather than hides from its moments of pain or evil. I was so moved by President Obama, who could not conceal his emotions as he framed the African-American experience as not a separate or shameful past, but a key part of who we are as Americans. And Congressman John Lewis, standing with the moral authority of someone beaten but not broken during the Civil Rights Movement, as he sought to help a nation bind its racial wounds, using the museum as part of the healing balm. What lightened my mood and lessened my fear was listening to Patti LaBelle sing the song I requested, Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come. Her rendition reminded us that even in the most difficult time, change was possible. Her closing line that the change would be Hillary was embraced by the audience, especially Bill Clinton, who leaped from his seat, would ultimately be proven wrong only a few weeks later. As the voice of God called me to speak, all I could think about was how Congressman Lewis's feet were blocking my path to the podium. After 11 years, all I could do was pray, "Please, Lonnie, don't trip," because that is all that anyone would remember. I managed to arrive at the podium, and I was choked with emotion and gripped with fear. And once again, I was overwhelmed when I saw so many people standing, applauding, and calling out my name. At that moment, my thoughts turned to my father and grandfather, both named Lonnie. My grandfather, who began life as a sharecropper on the Perry plantation outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, had sparked my love of history, and my dad, a scientist and teacher whose race had limited his career options, had prepared me to be a black man in America. My mind drifted back over the years it had taken me to arrive at this setting. I could never have imagined all the experiences, disappointments, times of great joy, all the visits, and all the people I would encounter. Most importantly, I felt the spirit of my namesakes, the other Lonnie Bunches, because in many ways, the crowd was honoring them too, their struggles and their lives as much as they were recognizing me. I could not believe that the 100-year-long journey and my own 11-year sojourn to create a black presence on the National Mall was over. So many experiences throughout my career had prepared me and positioned me for this, the grandest challenge of my life, what some have labeled my calling. As a young curator at the National Museum of American History, I had been tasked to lead a curatorial team to craft an exhibition that explored America during the 19th century. A major element of the exhibition would explore the impact and the legacy of the enslaved. To humanize the experience of slavery, I wanted to focus on a single plantation as a microcosm of the history of the peculiar institution. I traveled throughout the South in search of the perfect subject. I visited sugar plantations in Louisiana, and cotton plantations in Alabama, and tobacco farms in North Carolina. Eventually, I was taken to the Friendfield estate, a rice plantation outside of Georgetown, South Carolina. There, standing next to a slave cabin, extant since the 1840s, was Princey Jenkins. In his 90s, Mr. Jenkins had once lived in one of the cabins with his enslaved grandmother. To tap the knowledge Princey Jenkins had about the life of the enslaved on that plantation was the holy grail for a young historian. He told me how the enslaved did a hard sweep in the front of the cabin to kill the grass so there would be no vermin near their home. He took me to the rear of the cabin and explained the food that the enslaved grew to supplement the rations they were given. Next, we went to one side of the cabin, and he spoke about the role children played in monitoring the chimney to alert the adults in case of fires. Then I went to the other side of the cabin, but Mr. Jenkins would not accompany me. I asked him what had happened there, and he again refused to come to that side of the cabin. Finally, I implored him to explain, and he just said that he would not come over because there was nothing but rattlesnakes living there. After I stopped running, I asked him why he had not mentioned how dangerous that spot might have been. He replied that people used to remember. Now too much is forgotten. He then said words that have shaped my career. If you are a historian, then your job better be to help people remember not just what they want to remember, but what they need to remember. Right after he said those words, he shook my hand and left me standing alone by the cabin as he returned to his work as the caretaker of the plantation. I never saw him again, and I am sorry that I did not have the foresight to thank him for sharing his wisdom and his history with a stranger from Washington, D.C. The struggle to help reshape America's memory, to recenter race in the construction of the nation's identity, and in the words of Mr. Jenkins, to remember what America needed to remember, not just what it wanted to recall about the role and impact of African Americans by creating a place on the National Mall, was a century-long battle. From 1915, the idea for a memorial in Washington was initiated by African American veterans of the Civil War whose presence and contributions to the Union victory had not been included in many of the commemorations that accompanied the 50th anniversary of the war's conclusion. At a time when racial segregation was the law of the land, when hundreds of African Americans were lynched and brutalized annually, when the images of blacks in film, in advertising, and in the media were ripe with stereotypes that denigrated and dehumanized, the idea to create a counter-narrative was embraced by many in the African American community. It was hoped that this entity would not only honor the patriotism of the African American soldier, but would also have a physical space for programs and presentations that would expand America's knowledge about the black community. Just as this initiative was getting organized, the First World War seized the nation's attention, and the monument was never constructed. During the 1920s, a diverse array of African Americans, including Mary McLeod Bethune, W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell and Kelly Miller supported the notion of a black presence on the National Mall, a campaign made visible in part by the African American press, led to the hiring of Harlem architect Eric R. Williams, who created the preliminary design for what was called the National Negro Monument. In 1929, the U.S. Congress would pass Public Law 107, signed by President Calvin Coolidge, that would support the creation of such a building, but it would need massive non-federal fundraising support, something that the onset of the Great Depression made impossible. The notion of recognizing the contributions of black Americans gained currency as the nation struggled to change during the post-World War II civil rights movement. To many, among them Congressman James Scheuer, a Democrat from New York, the civil rights struggle should also broaden American education to include the presence and contributions of blacks. In 1966, Congress created a commission to study the feasibility of a National Negro History Museum. Though there were concerns raised by the fledgling African American museums and art galleries in numerous urban centers that a national presence may hurt their efforts, many leading African American figures testified in support of this museum. Baseball legend Jackie Robinson, Betty Shabazz, widow of Malcolm X, the author James Baldwin, to name only a few. Just as the commission moved forward, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, and the nation's gaze turned away from the creation of a cultural institution. The idea for a national presence lay fallow until the mid-1980s, when an African-American businessman who created the most successful tour mobile company in the nation's capital, Tom Mack, contacted Congressman Mickey Leland to campaign for a national museum on the Mall. Soon joined by civil rights hero John Lewis, Leland began to push for legislation that would create a standalone black museum. Time and time again, the bills failed to work their way through the legislative process. In the early 1990s, a bill passed the House of Representatives, but was squashed in 1993 when Senator Jesse Helms prevented it from receiving a vote in the Senate. After Leland's death in 1989, Congressman Lewis, working with a group of congressional colleagues, introduced legislation that seemed destined to failure every year. The Smithsonian was always ambivalent about the creation of a national museum that explored the black experience. As early as 1989, the leadership of the Smithsonian in the presence of Secretary Robert McCormick Adams opposed a separate museum and instead proposed that just a wing of the National Museum of American History be dedicated to this history. This remark generated a great deal of negative criticism and led the Smithsonian to bring one of the leading African American museum professionals in the nation, Claudine Brown, to assess the Smithsonian's efforts at interpreting and preserving black culture by conducting a study of the issues involved with creating a museum. Brown brilliantly evaluated the need for this work and explored the challenges to this task, including the limited number of professional people of color at the institution. After a careful and detailed analysis, Brown encouraged the Smithsonian to create a national museum. Though new leadership arrived at the Smithsonian in 1994 with the appointment of I. Michael Heyman as the 10th secretary, the institution still questioned the need for ethnic museums on the Mall. But as a concession to the growing interest in a museum in Congress, Brown received the institutional support to create the Center for African American History and Culture, not as a standalone museum, but as a unit housed within the Aging Arts and Industries building. This would allow Ms. Brown and her colleagues to enhance and enrich the African American presence on the Mall in ways that the National Museum of American History did not have the staff or the space to accomplish. In 2001, legislation introduced by John Lewis and Representative J.C. Watts, Jr., to create a 23-member presidential commission to evaluate issues of location, cost, and collections was enacted and signed by President George W. Bush. Led by Dimensions International CEO Robert Wright and Claudine Brown, the Commission released its report strongly advocating for a national museum on April 3, 2003. 6 months later, in November 2003, legislation crafted by John Lewis, J.C. Watts, Senator Sam Brownback, and Senator Max Cleland, the National Museum of African American History and Culture Act, Public Law 108-184, was enacted. Nearly 90 years after the idea was first broached, legislatively, the museum existed. As my father used to say, patience is a virtue. But 90 years was a long time to be virtuous. During the years leading to the passage of the museum legislation, I was blissfully distant. In January 2001, after 13 years as a curator and later as the Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the National Museum of American History, I left Washington to become the president of the Chicago Historical Society, CHS, now the Chicago History Museum, one of the nation's oldest museums that was venerated but not visited. Leaving the Smithsonian was extremely hard, and I had to come to grips with the fact that I would probably never return to the place where my career had begun and flourished. So as I settled into my first job as a museum director, I never thought about the National Museum of African American History and Culture much. Once the legislation was passed and the Smithsonian was in search of institutional leadership, I was startled by the number of board members of the CHS and university and museum colleagues and friends at the Smithsonian who assumed that the job of founding director was mine, or, at least, that I would want to be considered for the position. And during my time at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, NMAAHC, I came to realize this job was my calling. But in late 2004, when I was first approached about the possibility, I was less than interested. In fact, I turned down the chance to compete several times. There were many factors for my reluctance. The sheer enormity of the task was such a daunting challenge. The charge of conceptualizing and building a national museum, one potentially on the National Mall, was frightening enough. But even more unsettling was the reality that this was a museum of no staff, no site, no architect, no building, no collections, and no money. And it carried the weight and the burden of history. It was both the pressure of fulfilling dreams that had been deferred for nearly a century, and the realization that this museum would become the national arbiter and legitimizer of African American culture and history in ways that would overshadow all the years of amazing scholarship emanating from the nation's universities and colleges. I was not John Hope Franklin, Benjamin Quarles, Letitia Brown, Marion Thompson Wright, Sterling Stuckey, or any of the other pioneering scholars whose work and creativity forced the academic canons to make way for African American history and culture. I did not know if I could create a museum that was worthy of their efforts and talents. I was also not sure that I was willing to make the personal and professional sacrifices needed to make real the hopes of so many generations, and I was uncertain whether I wanted to spend a decade or more of what could be considered the prime of my career to take on a project that even the most ardent supporters doubted would be realized in their lifetimes. When Hill Hammock, chair of the Board of Trustees at the CHS, learned that my name was being bandied about, he suggested that it would be better to be the second director of the museum because the burden of being the founding leader would be too great. There was no denying that the pressure, the visibility, and the risks would be huge. I wrestled with what the impact of taking this job would have on my family and my health. If I did return...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?